We've just seen the power of Paul and his letters in early Christianity in the words of those who didn't like Paul very much. But now let's turn instead to look at those who valued Paul so much that they wrote in his name or created histories about him. We find these texts both within the New Testament and outside of it. Let me first list for you those letters which scholars generally agree are written by Paul and his co-authors in the general order in which they may have been written. And these are all within the New Testament. First is 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and then also Romans. But also contained within the New Testament are traditions about Paul, texts about him or written in his name. The first I want to mention is the canonical Acts of the Apostles. It was written in the early 2nd century, roughly 50 years after Paul's last letter was written. In it we find another story of Paul. It's a story that doesn't quite match Paul's own, and yet has Paul as one of its major figures. In his own letters, Paul mentions only 3 trips to Jerusalem. Acts mentions 5. In his letters, Paul presents himself as a great letter writer, but not particularly fantastic at public speech. You remember that he wrote, "For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account." Yet in Acts, Paul never sits down to write a letter, but he's an eloquent man who can walk into town and take the stage. In his own letters, Paul talks about a thorn in the flesh. Even if we don't know exactly what this is, it indicates some physical challenge likely that he faced. Yet Acts has a perfectly healthy Paul winging his way around the Mediterranean basin. It's likely that the writer of Acts knew Paul's letters. And Acts Paul differs from the story we can piece together from Paul's own writing. The second example we have of Paul's prominence in early Christianity among those who supported and wanted to imitate Paul is found within the New Testament. There we find pseudepigraphical writings. Pseudepigraphy means texts that are written in someone else's name. And in the New Testament we have texts that are written in Paul's name that he himself didn't pen. In today's framework of intellectual property and copyright laws, we might be offended by this, thinking of it as a kind of forgery. But in antiquity, it wasn't uncommon for disciples or students to write in a teacher's name. And in ancient education, it was common to be assigned the task of writing something according to a famous writer's style, or to pen the speech of a famous person, what they might have said at a battle or in a major meeting of the political assembly. In the 1st and 2nd century, we also find pseudo-historical letters. Letters, for example, in Plato's name were written then. So too, within the New Testament, we have letters written in Paul's name, in his tradition. 2 Thessalonians, for example, imitates 1 Thessalonians, yet it changes the perspective of 1 Thessalonians in such a way that it indicates a significantly different social setting. 3 letters, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, also called the pastoral epistles, are written in Paul's name. They likely date to the beginning of the 2nd century and may have been conceived as a testament to Paul's life, that is, as a kind of document of what he would have written as his last words, had he been able to do so. Scholars call Colossians and Ephesians Deutero-Pauline materials. That is, they're clearly influenced by Paul's thought, but aspects of their grammar, vocabulary, and theology indicate that they were probably written later. The text of Hebrews sometimes circulated with Paul's letters, but even in the early 3rd century, Christians, such as the famous Origen, said that the style and the tone weren't Paul's own. Third, we find materials outside the New Testament written about Paul or in his name, celebrating him and seeing him as authoritative. He certainly inspired more than just those texts within the New Testament that are written in his name. We find, for example, a letter called 3 Corinthians. We find one called the letter to the Laodiceans. There are pseudepigraphical letters between Paul and the Roman philosopher and politician Seneca. 4th century Christians wanted to imagine Paul in contact with a key Roman thinker and writer. Seneca, a member of the court of Nero who was forced to commit suicide because he was suspected of political seditions. So Christians in the 4th century wrote the key figure of Paul into Roman history, making him a philosophical discussion partner with Seneca, and having Seneca admit to Paul that Nero persecuted Christians and Jews unjustly. Even earlier, in the 2nd century, stories about Paul called the Acts of Paul circulated around the Mediterranean basin. These include the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the story of a woman converted to Christianity who becomes a saint in her own right. Other early Christian writers imitated Paul. By the late 1st century, a Christian text called 1 Clement imitates his style. And in the early 2nd century, Ignatius of Antioch, in his letters to churches, self-consciously imitates Paul and speaks about Paul as an apostle and authority. Ignatius also assumes that after his death, his letters would be collected and disseminated. This shows us that he and others were very early familiar with some collection of Paul's letters. As we've seen, there's an immense debate about Paul's letters and Paul himself, even while he was alive, and certainly very soon after his death. By the 3rd and 4th century, some Christians are writing commentaries and homilies, interpretations and sermons of Paul's letters. Among some, these letters had achieved the status of sacred writing. Other Christians at the same time thought that Paul's letters and tradition did not fit at all within Christianity. This difference may be rather overwhelming. The joy of studying early Christian history in the New Testament is the profusion of unexpected materials, the details that unfold within and outside the New Testament. Paul's letters in themselves and immediately thereafter allow us to overhear a struggle and a debate as these assemblies tried to figure out who they were, how they fit into the broader political, economic, cultural, and religious matrix of the Roman Empire, and what within Paul's letters they wished to use and what they wished to abandon.